This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a program brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust and sponsored by Heritage New Zealand. I'm Dougal Stevenson. In this program, Gregor Campbell tells us about a Dunedin sea captain who was captured by pirates. Bill Southworth profiles the folk hero Arawhata Bill. We hear about a champion Purakaunui Oyster Shucker, and finish with a sad story about how European disease and grog ravaged early Otago Māori. The lawlessness of the seas around China early last century was dramatically illustrated when a local Dunedin captain, Frederick Joslin, had his ship boarded by pirates. This report from Gregor Campbell.
In the early years of the 20th century, China was in a state of political change and had a lack of government control in some regions, which allowed disorder to prevail. Captain Frederick William Joslin experienced the effects of this when his ship, the stern paddle-wheeler Seaman, rumoured to have a large amount of coinage aboard, was targeted by pirates. On his return to New Zealand, he was interviewed by the Evening Post. The language is that of its day. On the memorable trip under review, the Seaman left Canton on the 14th July. A number of pirates, with designs on the specie which the vessel was supposed to be carrying, boarded the vessel in the guise of passengers. At about 7 p.m, after the captain had dined with his chief engineer, Mr. Segi, and Dr. MacDonald, a missionary doctor, he left the saloon and went out on deck for a smoke. He saw a Chinaman pursuing an Indian watchman round the deck, and thinking it was a private squabble between the two men, felled the Chinaman with a blow. Immediately on rising, the Chinaman, who was armed, fired at the captain, the bullet entering his chest and coming out on the right side. After this, about 50 of the pirates commenced to fire shots from all parts of the ship. The captain set off for shelter in the saloon and, on arriving there, noticed blood flowing from his wound, which was the first he knew of his being wounded. Dr. MacDonald made the skipper sit down on a sofa, and while there the pirates surrounded the saloon and commenced firing at its occupants through the portholes. The engineer, meanwhile, had secreted himself under the boilers in the engine room. The pair in the saloon were subjected to a hot fire and, to get out of range, crawled under the table where the angle was too great for the bullets to reach them. As the firearms proved of no avail, the pirates resorted to the use of a stink pot, which was thrown inside the saloon. The prisoners were now in a dilemma, and to avoid being suffocated by the fumes of the stink pot, they decided to go out on the deck again and face the enemy. The doctor, being a missionary and well known amongst the Chinese, thought that by speaking in the Chinese language he would be able to reason with the pirates. Accordingly, he laid out flat, crying "Mo ta, mo ta," which means "do not strike," as he progressed. As soon as the pirates saw the prostrate man, one of them approached him and deliberately fired a shot through his brain, killing him instantly. During this time, the captain was endeavouring to gain his room near the forepart of the bridge. He met about 20 of the pirates coming out of his room, and they immediately opened fire on him again. As a last resource, the captain fell to the deck and, with a faint hope of saving his skin, pretended to be dead. He was examined by the pirates, who kicked and generally maltreated the apparently dead body. The captain's clothes were torn off to see if he had a money belt on him, and a ring was wrenched off one of his fingers, and all his valuables were purloined. The Chinese could not make out where the captain had been shot and commenced to make a closer examination. One man discovered the bullet hole in his chest and, with a fiendish laugh, thrust his finger into the cavity. This quite satisfied the pirates, who left the body with a few parting kicks. As darkness had come on, the Chinese went onto the bridge and ordered the pilot to take the steamer to Fanwu, which was done. On arrival, as the captain learned afterwards from the pilot, 5 snake boats ranged alongside, and a horrible scene ensued, the Chinese commencing to knock the ship about and break everything of any value about the decks. They then retired below and pillaged the cargo. But not finding the specie, the boats gradually left the ship. When all the boats were clear, the pilot was informed that his captain had been killed, and the ship was now his to take it wherever he liked. When the ship was quite free of the pirates, the engineer was called out of his place of hiding by a fireman. He made inquiries for the captain and was told that he had been shot. Proceeding along the deck, he came across the dead body of Dr. MacDonald and afterwards found the captain all safe but severely shaken. Captain Jocelyn was able to get up and take his ship to Sam Shui. The doctor of the British gunboat Moorhen was sent for on his arrival, and he dressed the wound of the sorely tried skipper, who, within half an hour, was steering his vessel back to Canton. Leaving the vessel there, Captain Jocelyn went to Hong Kong, where he spent 10 days in hospital and then set out for a 6 months rest in New Zealand. Captain Jocelyn is now on his way to Dunedin. He still feels the effect of his wound, but he hopes to get back to the east after his rest. "I have some old scores to pay off out there," remarked the captain as he bade farewell. Captain Jocelyn died at Hong Kong in 1909 of heat stroke and is remembered on the stone of his family grave at Anderson's Bay Cemetery. And I am the not in the least piratical Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
The rugged country between Haast and Jackson's Bay was once the stamping ground of a famous mountain man known as Arawhata Bill. His feats of exploration and gold prospecting have passed into West Coast folklore. Bill Southworth has prepared this profile of him.
America has its frontier celebrity, Davy Crockett. We have Arawhata Bill, our own explorer, folk hero, and king of the Wild West. Next time you look at the rugged mountains and dense bush in southwestland, try to imagine him surviving there alone until well in his 70s, an Old Testament figure with a flowing white beard, foraging for what food he could find and endlessly prospecting for gold in the hope of striking it rich. Arawhata Bill never did strike a mother lode, but his exploration of the remote parts of northwest Otago and the southern west coast, relying on his own resources and hunting and gathering skills at a time when there were no roads, bridges or other people to fall back on, saw his reputation grow to the level where even poems were written about him. Ian Doherty, in his book about Arawhata Bill, sums up what was special about the man.
An independence and simplicity which enabled him to live alone for long periods in remote places. A strength and determination which enabled him to spend weeks moving heavy loads over long distances and up difficult gorges and over dangerous passes. An unaffected eccentricity which saw him tackling snow-covered mountain slopes while dressed in a three-piece suit and thigh gumboots and wielding a miner's pick.
William James O'Leary was born at Weatherstons near Lawrence in 1865, the son of Timothy and Mary O'Leary. His father Timothy was a gold miner who had joined 5,000 other miners packed into a shanty town with 14 hotels in what was then the biggest of the Tuapeka goldfields. Later his father deserted the family, leaving Mary and her 8 children behind. He subsequently died of a heart attack on the Hokitika riverbed in 1900. In his early teens, Bill left school and worked as a rabbiter and then a cattle drover at St. Bathans on the Maniatoto Plains. He then accepted a job keeping open the Haast Pass bridle track, the forerunner of the Haast Pass Road, which was not opened until 1960. Whenever he could, Bill would buy gear and provisions and head off searching for gold as a lone prospector. By the time he was 31, he was prospecting in the remote and unmapped valleys of northwest Otago and southwestland. In 1897, from Glenorchy, at the head of Lake Whakatipu, he headed west up the Dart Valley and crossed over to the Arawhata Valley on the west coast, in a trip no one had done before. In doing so, he had achieved a transalpine crossing and return, via a 6,000-foot pass, which today bears his name. During the trip, he lived on rabbits, wekas and kakapos. Later, he sometimes travelled with a pack horse, and always travelled with an iron camp oven, in which he made damper, a type of bread, as well as bird stews and his main staple, porridge. He once confided that he'd even tasted our national bird, the kiwi, which he said was beautiful to eat. He also lived on trout, as the lakes and rivers were full of the introduced fish, which sometimes weighed as much as 7 kilos. Solo prospecting, though, was a tough life. As he later told a journalist for the British Wide World magazine,
"I've seen great boulders brought down by the concussion of thunder, and I've seen lightning strike. I've seen rain come down in sheets, turning rivers into raging torrents as you looked. Still, it was sometimes grand to be caught out, and I shall never forget the time I saw a lightning flash splinter a great beech and fling pieces all over the place. You don't sleep under trees in that country during thunderstorms."
when he was not prospecting, Arawhata Bill took on a variety of casual jobs. One of the longest ones was one he had with the Westland County Council as a ferryman. There were no bridges across the rivers, and the ferryman system had been set up to combat drownings. He was allocated the Arawhata and Waitoto rivers and lived in a simple hut near the latter river. Bill continued to prospect in remote southwestland areas for the whole of the first part of the 20th century. As his age increased, so did his reputation for his stoical courage, his mastery of the rugged wilderness, and his endless prospecting for gold. But eventually his age caught up with him, and he was no longer able to carry the 100-pound backpacks he used to carry his provisions in. In 1943, his health deteriorated, and he entered the Sacred Heart home of the Little Sisters of the Poor in Dunedin's Anderson's Bay. He attracted the attention of journalists who called it the home. At first he seemed resigned to his new life, and in an Otago Daily Times reporter was able to write,
"In the distance beyond the hazy city, the hills shone clearly in the morning sun. The old man's blue eyes sought them out as he said, a little wistfully, 'No, I'm past the urge to go wandering. You can't do it at my age. It's all in the past. And I'm happy here with my gardening, my reading, yes, and with my memories.'"
But the call of the wild was too strong for the elderly man. He later absconded from the home and caught the bus to Queenstown. He had barely recovered his panning dish and began prospecting when the weather changed. Trapped out in the open during a snowstorm, he was forced to sleep under a tree near Lake Hayes in the freezing cold, with thick snow on the ground. Next morning he made it to the Shotover pub, where he was recognised by an old acquaintance who described him as the toughest rooster who ever walked. Arawhata Bill was persuaded to return to the Little Sisters of the Poor in Dunedin. 4 months later, he went for another wander and was picked up in Mornington on the route out of town. He told people he was headed to Queenstown because he had some stuff over in Arawhata that he wanted to have a look at. This time he was too ill to be returned to the Sacred Heart home and was admitted to Dunedin Hospital. A week later, on November the 8th, 1947, he died there at the age of 82. A private interment followed in an unmarked pauper's grave in Anderson's Bay Cemetery, paid for by the Little Sisters of the Poor. 12 years after his death, he was finally given a headstone following a public appeal for funds. By then, his legend was secure, and in a poem, the poet Dennis Glover paid tribute to the old man and his lifelong fascination with the allure for gold.
"It got you at last, Bill, the razor edge that cut you down. Not in the gullies, nor in the pass, but in a bed in town. R.I.P. where no gold lies, but in your own questing soul, rich in faith and a wild surmise. You should have been told only in you was the gold. Mountain and river paid you no fee, mountain melting to the river, river to the sea."
For much of this material, I'm grateful to Ian Doherty and his book Arawhata Bill, the story of legendary gold prospector William James O'Leary. Regular listeners may recall that Ian, in the past, has presented material on this program. This is Bill Southworth reporting for Heritage Matters.
An early oyster shucker and fisherman in the Port Chalmers area at the turn of the last century has provided many a story worth retelling. Here's Gregor Campbell with some of them.
Joseph Hewitt, known as Old Joe, was an identity in the Port Chalmers area, living with his wife at Purakaunui in the late 19th century. He died in 1912 and was recalled by a local writer in the Evening Star in 1929 under the heading Purakaunui Days. A figure well known to most visitors to Purakaunui in the 90s was Old Joe, who was engaged in fishing. His wife also assisted to keep the home fires burning by keeping a few summer boarders. Joe was a sufficiently interesting type of fisherman to form a model for well-known Dunedin artists. Besides being an experienced fisherman, Joe had another qualification, particulars of which he once gave to me. Observing a lady eating with great relish some of the oysters which he had procured for her, Joe remarked, "It's a funny thing, ain't it? I can't abide oysters myself, but you should see me a-opening of 'em." Frequently some holidaymaker at Purakaunui dared to brave the billow and the breeze and accompanied Joe on one of his fishing expeditions. On one occasion, when he was fishing beyond the bar, Joe netted several trout. It was surmised that they reached the ocean from the Waitati stream. Joe tried to sell them to local residents, but he asked too fancy a price, so he continued on his way to the railway station. None of the waiting passengers were sufficiently interested to buy, so he offered them to a gentleman on the platform of the incoming train. This gentleman seemed greatly taken up with the offer, and asked Joe how and where he had caught the trout, and what was his name and address. To all these questions Joe gave frank and truthful replies. Then the stranger divulged the fact that he was the ranger. I met Joe on the way back, and he told me his troubles. "Weren't I a mug? But how was I to know he was a bloomin' ranger? But perhaps he'll forget all about it." But the ranger didn't, and in due course Joe appeared at the court and was fined. Early one morning a monstrous sunfish was stranded on the beach at Purakaunui. Joe was the first person to see it and, scenting profit, took immediate possession. He indicated his proprietorship by attaching one end of a clothesline to the fish and the other to a stake. He was convinced that the Otago Museum authorities would hear of the find and would offer him a good price for it as a specimen. The expected offer did not eventuate, and very soon the sunfish began to emit odours appertaining to decay. People began to make complaints to Joe about his property. He replied truthfully enough that he had not brought the fish ashore, but the complainants asserted that if he claimed the fish as an asset, he could not disown it as a liability. Much against his will, Joe had to turn to and row his treasure trove out to sea. So was added another to the stock of hard luck yarns. With the establishment of the old age pension scheme, Joe became entitled to the usual allowance. Joe was not ungrateful, and whenever he visited the city to collect his pension, he took the opportunity of drinking the health of the government not once but several times. One hot summer afternoon, when they were returning from their periodical trip to town, Joe and his wife were offered a lift across the inlet, which at that hour was an expanse of dry sand. Mrs. Joe and the driver occupied the only seat in the trap. Joe was stowed away at the back. At the end of the journey, Mrs. Joe turned to speak to her husband. To her amazement, he was not there. He had performed the vanishing trick. Mrs. Joe had heard of a chicken being spirited away by a hawk, but Joe was no chicken. It would have required a great auk to have carried him off, and no bird bigger than an albatross had been seen in the district. Whatever was the cause of his mysterious disappearance, she had no doubt that Joe would turn up sooner or later. Joe always did. What had happened to Joe? Briefly this. The hot afternoon sun and the liberal refreshment to which he had treated himself in town had induced a drowsy feeling which very soon culminated in his falling asleep. His hold loosened, with the result that he rolled out of the back of the cart onto the soft sand, where he continued to slumber unnoticed. Meanwhile, the tide was on the turn, and soon the wavelets began to creep nearer and nearer, his recumbent figure whispering as they came, "We're coming, Joe. Look out, Joe. Get up, Joe." By and by, they touched him ever so gently, and Joe's dreams took a different turn. He thought he was in the Antarctic, encountering snow and ice and blizzards. The wavelets continued to advance, and Joe half awoke, wondering why the temperature had gone down with a bump. He reached out for the bedclothes to pull them up. There were no bedclothes. He sat up in surprise and found that his bed was the wide world and his mattress water-covered sand. Old Joe was found dead in his bed at the age of 80. His remains lie next to those of his wife, Margaret, in an unmarked grave in the Port Chalmers Cemetery. And I am the not yet unmarked Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
The first regular contact between Otago Māori and the early sealers and whalers did not end well. Bill Southworth has been looking at this fatal connection, which saw many Māori either die from European diseases or become slaves to alcohol, permanently trapped into a degraded lifestyle.
When the first tentative contacts were made by European sealers with the Otago Māori in the 1800s, there were estimated to be thousands of them living in the province, with hundreds settled round the bays and inlets of Otago Harbour. In addition, there were probably 200 to 300 living in Karatani Waikouaiti and another 100 at Tairi Mouth. It has been estimated that there was possibly a total of up to 5,000 living in the Otago and Southland area. The sealing period did not last long, as an intensive slaughter of the animals so reduced the herds that within a few years the trade had died out. In his book, The History of Otago, Dr. A.H. McClintock writes,
"The whole of the southern coastline of the South Island, from the western fjords to the Otago beaches, was the resort of sealers, colonial, English and American, who, without any guiding principle except indiscriminate killing, and freed from the restraining influence of the law, surrendered to the lust of slaughter and the lure of wealth. Every inlet was the scene of frenzied butchery, made more terrible by the passivity of the victims."
The large American sealing vessel, the Favourite, reached Sydney in 1806 with a cargo of 60,000 sealskins, said to have been procured on the east coast of New Zealand. The whaling industry came next. It was attracted by the large number of whales which came along the Otago coast in the breeding season, which lasted from March through October. This was a more substantial industry which required the establishment of shore stations with permanent buildings and accommodation, where the whales could be cut up and their blubber boiled for oil in large rendering pots. Shore stations were established in Otago by the Weller brothers and at Waikouaiti by Johnny Jones in the early 1830s. The presence of these raiding villages and the Māori who were attracted to them led to a tragedy. By the time the Europeans first undertook a census in the 1840s, the Māori population of Otago, which had numbered in the thousands, had dropped to just over 400 survivors. What had happened to cause such a massive decline in their population? Although there had been the odd fatal clash with sealers and whalers, and some tribal warfare between Ngaitahu and the invading North Island tribe Ngāti Taua, these did not account for the catastrophic decline. Unfortunately, the real reason was the earlier contact with hardy but often dissolute crews from whaling ships. They brought with them alcohol and a demand for prostitution, but worst of all, new diseases for which the Māori had no immunity. Initially, Māori fell victim to influenza and a small outbreak of smallpox, but the real disaster came in 1835, when there was a serious outbreak of measles. It was reported that Māori at Otago plunged into the sea in an attempt to cool their fevers. Today, just south of Tokomariru River mouth, there's a memorial to members of a summer camp there who were totally wiped out. The death toll from the disease is estimated to be twice as bad as the Black Death in England in the 14th century, which reduced the English population by almost half. On a hill called Ohinitu, overlooking Otago Harbour, the Ngaitahu chief Tuawaiki was later to reminisce to settlers,
"This was one of our largest settlements, and it was beyond even the reach of Te Rauparaha. We lived secure and feared no enemy. But one year when I was a youth and a ship came from Sydney, and she brought the measles amongst us, It was winter, as it is now. In a few months, most of the inhabitants sickened and died. Whole families on this spot disappeared and left no one to represent them. My people lie all around us. And now you can tell Colonel Wakefield why we cannot part with this portion of our land.
The Weller whaling establishment at Otago was the largest in the country. In 1835 it had 11 boats, staffed with a crew of 85, most of whom were European. It also built dozens of buildings, and it had the look of a thriving village. More than 100 whales were killed, some within the harbour. The boom didn't last, as the whales were beginning to abandon their ancient sanctuaries. Overkilling at Johnny Jones's station at Mooraki also saw the whales avoiding their breeding grounds, and it too was in a state of financial collapse by 1845. Within a decade, the Weller village was abandoned, leaving behind deserted buildings fast falling into decay. 2 houses had been transformed into public houses, where Māori were said to spend their money as soon as they were paid for gardening and other work. The prices for the liquor, usually brandy, which was said to be vile, was sold at highly exorbitant prices. The whalers had a reputation for depravity and drunkenness. Although this may have been overdone, thanks to the stories of narrow-minded Wowser missionaries who visited from time to time, it is true some were dissipated and threw away their wages on highly priced booze, which was distributed at company stalls in lieu of wages. One ship discharged 120 tons of liquor at Waikawaiti when there were only 40 Europeans there. Māori developed a thirst for European liquor, becoming addicted to it, and started hanging around the whaling stations, spending the wages they were paid for gardening and other tasks, for more and more alcohol. Visitors came to notice that many Māori now dressed in rags and looked depressed and dilapidated, a forlorn remnant of the flourishing tribes that used to populate the area. In their book, called Early Dunedin, Mari Goodall and George Griffiths observe that
the ravages of disease and the demoralization of traditional ways of life through contact with the riffraff of the whaling stations severely affected Otago Māori. Tuhawaiki, a local chief, told George Clark, sub-protector of Aborigine, when he arrived to supervise the purchase of land in 1844, "We are but a poor remnant now, but even in my time we were a large and powerful tribe."
On another occasion, Chief Tuhawaiki said,
"We had a worse enemy, even than Te Rauparaha, and that was the visit of the Pākehā with his drink and his disease. You think us very corrupted, but the very scum of Port Jackson shipped as whalers or landed as sealers on this coast."
What had played out was a familiar and depressing scene, typical of many colonisations. The fatal impact caused by an indifference to the needs of an indigenous race and the clash of incompatible civilisations. This is Bill Southworth reporting.
The award-winning Heritage Matters is broadcast on the first Monday of each month at 9:30 a.m. and replayed on the following Sunday at 7 p.m. There are further replays on the third week of the month, Thursday at 1 p.m. and Sunday at 7 p.m. Or you can listen as a podcast from the Otago Access Radio website at oar.org.nz.
As Aotearoa New Zealand's national heritage agency, Heritage New Zealand Pohere Taonga is proud to sponsor Heritage Matters. Celebrate our heritage by becoming a member to visit more than 20 heritage places we care for across the motu for free. You'll receive a subscription to our award-winning magazine, exclusive member events, and free or discounted admission to over 1,000 international heritage places. Support the heritage of Aotearoa New Zealand. Check out visitheritage.co.nz.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.